Thanks for that, Bianca. To round out our coverage of the British referendum, Steve Keen is on the show. He's the head of Kingston University's Department of Economics, History and Politics. Ed asked him to weigh in on whether Britain should decide to walk away from the EU, and here is what he had to say.
I was in favour of leaving, not so much in the case of what the benefits or costs should be for the English economy, but I sort of posed what I call myself the Groucho Marxist question. I'm in a club. Do I want to belong to this club? And the answer is no.
Well, I want to go into some of that, because the so-called European Parliament is unique among parliaments because it actually cannot propose any legislation.
I know.
All laws are formulated and proposed by the unelected European Commission. Isn't that a problem for Europe?
That's a total problem. And I've had people saying that, I was saying it's undemocratic, and they came back and said, look, they can vote on this and they can vote on that, and they're all elected ultimately. It is the only parliament, so far as I'm aware, in the world where the laws are drafted by the commissars. Pardon me, I meant the Commission. It is just like the old Russian system where the bureaucrats run everything. And it is, you can amend the laws, but you can't craft them in the first place, and it's impossible to. It's like you're trying to turn what they call a sow's ears into a silk purse. That's the best possible option you have. So it's not democratic, and it's dominated by the bureaucrats. And if they were good managers, it wouldn't be a problem. But of course, they believe neoclassical economics.
Right.
They're the disastrous managers.
Well, let me ask you about this, because the British economist Andrew Watt, he takes a different approach here. And I know that you know what I'm about to say, because he was talking directly to you, and he wrote, quote, "The EP is a democratic institution with real power. A large power resource lies not with the unelected EU bureaucracy, the Commission, but the Council of Ministers. But they are the representatives for the different policy areas of the 28 democratically elected national governments." And he says he finds it rather odd that you would call someone like Osborne, whether one appreciates his policies or not, a political appointee, because obviously he's represented, there's a representative democracy there that Osborne is supposed to be. So that's his whole argument. I mean, what do you make of that?
It's 3 steps removed from representative democracy, and representative democracy itself has enough flaws. People often say, why vote for a politician? If whoever you vote for, a politician gets in, which is half the problem to begin with. But then you have the second remove of being put onto the Council of Ministers, and then you have 19 people from 19 countries, I think it is, who actually have somebody on the Council of Ministers. And to actually get something, if you have a huge electoral majority for something in your particular country, which involves changing rules that apply at the EU, you might have a 99% majority wanting to change something about how your country is managed, and then it gets to the EU and it has to be agreed to by 19 other countries. Now, all you need is 1 or 2 of those countries to refuse, and nothing happens. And even worse, of course, as we've seen in the case of Greece, people wanted to break away from austerity. No, I'm sorry, you can't have it. In fact, we're going to make you more severe austerity. So it completely overrules any expression of the will of the people.
So, my question then is what do you do with that system? How do you reform that system from the inside as opposed to leaving?
I don't think you can. I don't think you can. This, to me, this looks like a 19th century marriage contract. You're in there, and if your husband bashes you up, try to talk him into not doing it occasionally. It really is, there's no possibility to extricate yourself. It was actually designed in such a way to make it impossible to pull out. Once you're in, you can't get out again. And that itself would only have worked if it was perfectly designed in the very first instance. Now it was actually, you were not hopping into a perfect Lamborghini to go off with with Art and Senna as your driver and all these people as security and passengers. You were locked in as a crash dummy into an accident vehicle.
Wow, that's a good analogy, I think, very graphic. Let me ask you this, okay? The late British economist Wayne Godley, who I think he wrote the following in rejection of the euro in 1992. He said, quote, "I think that the central government of any sovereign state ought to be striving all the time to determine the optimum level of public provision, the correct overall burden of taxation, the correct allocation of total expenditures between competing requirements, and the just distribution of the tax burden. It must also determine the extent to which any gap between expenditure and taxation is financed by making a draft on the central bank, and how much it is financed by borrowing, and on what terms." Now, is that what sovereignty is all about?
Largely, it's having the capacity to control your own economic destiny as best you can, because obviously a capitalist economy is far from controllable. And sovereignty was completely handed away by anybody who entered the EU. the European, particularly the Euro zone as well, because as well as giving up any capacity to vary your exchange rate because you no longer had a national currency, you also gave it the right to control your fiscal expenditure. And the central bank, you no longer had a central bank, you had a remote central bank which had its own rules that limited how much they'd fund of your deficit. So it was a complete abrogation of sovereignty without anything to compensate. In fact, they made it worse for anybody who entered there. Again, it only would have worked if it was a Lamborghini rather than a crash dummy, and unfortunately it was a crash dummy.
Well, how much sovereignty does the UK have with regard to what Godley was saying outside of the Eurozone, but within the EU?
Yeah, much more so. It is not a significant issue for the British, and this is why one of the reasons I favoured exiting, because yes, it may have some negative consequences, but of course there's arguments on the other side, like Richard Werner made about the positive consequences of leaving the European Union. But it's not a life and death issue as it would be for France or Italy and so on, or certainly Greece or Spain. So for those countries, leaving the EU would mean leaving the euro, which is a huge shock, but also a huge liberation from the European Union straitjacket. England, it may have a big impact one way or the other. It's not an obvious outcome one way or the other. And given that, I think what I see this as being is a symbolic gesture to say the European Union was badly designed from the outset. The euro itself was a catastrophe from the outset. Let's start again, let's change, because, again, using the wife syndrome, unless you leave a marriage, you've got very little chance of changing your husband's behaviour. This is actually a departure. It's a minor one compared to France or Italy leaving, but it's enough, hopefully, to wake up the bureaucrats, in particular Schäuble, that change has to happen.